Yoni Bashan is the Australian's correspondent in Israel, and he's just returned from Gaza, where he journeyed with the Israeli Defence Forces behind the giant fence that separates Israel from Gaza. Yoni, tell me about this trip that you took with the IDF. How did it start and where did you go?
Well, it started with us meeting at a staging point about 300 or 400 metres from the border fence with Gaza. And so on the Israeli side, it looks like lush green fields. It's a pastoral setting. It's almost storybook in its style. So while you're driving in, you're passing enormous Humvees that are scoring tracks in the mud. There are helicopter gunships flying overhead. While we were standing here, we could hear the sound of gunfire, rocket fire, outgoing tank fire. So it's a beautiful setting, but it's punctuated constantly by the sounds of a nearby battle. And essentially it was from this point that we were loaded up into the back of jeeps, some of which were mounted with recoilless rifles. All the men around us were armed with enormous firearms. And in we went along a dirt track and a road that had been specially paved by the IDF. And that in itself is an indication of how long the IDF has actually been bedded down in this location. They've actually paved a road into Khan Yunis to assist with their logistics and the transport of their materials to the front. And so we travel along this winding road out from the Israeli side and onto the Gaza side. And you pass through a fence that, to be honest, is not particularly impressive. It's about 4 or 5 metres high. It's metallic. You can sort of put your fingers through it, a bit like a playground fence. And without much fanfare, you enter Gaza. And now you're in the war zone proper. And we continued along this road for probably about a mile until we reached the outskirts of the city and what was once a really affluent area. This was an area that we were told was filled with villas and homes that would be rather enviable, that probably had, sprawling gardens and swimming pools and such. But you drive through it now and it's just wreckage. It's a wasteland. It's rubble and ash and dirt and dust. There's absolutely nothing here. It clearly looks like a war zone and a place of intensive fighting, which has been going on there for the past 60 days or so.
Khan Yunis is the more southern city in Gaza. It's further to the south than the main city, Gaza City. And it's where, of course, civilians gathered after the Israeli Defence Forces warned them to move south after October 7 in preparation for Israel's attack. Did you see evidence of civilian life having continued there and the crowding of civilians that we're hearing about from Hamas?
It would be almost impossible for civilians to be gathering at any point that I saw in Khan Yunis. One of the first reasons is we were taken on this particular embed with the IDF to what is essentially a supply depot. They've set themselves up in a school that was taken back from Hamas militants. And this is clearly not an area where civilians can gather or live safely. And all around it, really, there isn't much for anyone there to shelter in. There aren't homes. There are a few stray buildings that remain standing. But really, the civilians who are living in this area have all been moved far west, much closer to the water. And that's where the refugee camps are and where the advice has been to those civilians to shelter safely while the IDF continues to encircle these areas and push out and drive out the Hamas militants that have bedded themselves down there.
You went to the scene of what sounds like a pretty heavy battle centred on a primary school. What had happened there?
So what had happened was the IDF had entered Khan Yunis from that border entry point, and we're not talking very far back. It's probably about a mile back. So pretty much they've entered and had to immediately begin taking neighbourhoods, suburbs, and eradicating the Hamas presence from the buildings. Now, what we were told was that this particular primary school was being used by Hamas militants to fire at the IDF. And we were told that it was a school that, like many other buildings in the immediate vicinity, had a tunnel shaft in it that led to the underground network of tunnels that run beneath Gaza. And so what had occurred is the IDF had gone in on December 5. They'd begun to eradicate the Hamas forces that were bedded down in the area. Our guide on this tour was the Lieutenant Colonel of the 55th Brigade, and it was his first day of deployment where he was involved in the fighting to take back this particular building.
We're about a mile from the center of Khan Yunis, the actual real center of Khan Yunis.
Where the fight is still raging.
The fight is still raging, yep. My friends, my comrades are still fighting there.
And 3 days later, he was still involved in taking back buildings in the area. In fact, he was in another school barely a few blocks away, where he and his unit had succeeded in picking off the Hamas sentries and the forces inside the building, but they'd neglected to identify a tunnel shaft in the basement of that building. So what they'd done is they'd gone inside, they'd taken a rest, they'd secured every single location in the building, and they thought they were alone. And that was done in the middle of the night. But by the morning, a few hours later, a cell of 4 Hamas militants had come up through a tunnel, through a shaft into the basement of that building, fired an RPG at these forces, immediately killed 2 of them, and injured 12 all up in the firefight that ensued. And one of the people that was injured was this particular lieutenant colonel who was showing us around. And it happened half an hour after this incident took place. He was standing in the foyer of the building. He was securing the area. A sniper was watching from a nearby location, took a shot, missed his vitals, and the bullet passed straight through clean the flesh of his forearm.
I personally was injured in one of those skirmishes, and it's part of the job.
You were injured.
Correct.
What happened?
I got a bullet in my arm. Came in and out.
In and out. You're back fighting what? How many days later?
A week later.
About a week later, you're back fighting.
Correct.
And he's an experienced soldier, but he's not a professional, is he? This is not his full-time job.
We're talking about a 46-year-old guy, an easygoing fella with an easy smile. I don't know what he does in his spare time, but he reminds me of the kind of person who probably goes windsurfing or on long cycling trips on the weekends. He has an office job. He works in IT. He's got a wife and 2 kids, 15 and 19-year-old. They live in Jerusalem. And on the day of October 7, he was at home like most other Israelis. It was 6 or 6:30 in the morning, and 4,000 odd rockets were being fired from Gaza into Israeli territory. He, like many others, was woken up by the sirens and by the alerts that were pinging through on his mobile phone. And that was in the morning, and he told us that by the afternoon he had gone with his unit down to the southern villages that were under attack. He found himself in the village of Kfar Aza, which, as listeners might know, was one of the worst massacre sites on the day of October 7. And he spent the day with other IDF units fighting their way inside, taking back the kibbutz. And then he told us, in his terms, he had the challenging task, as he said, to remove the civilian bodies from Kfar Aza. So he spent the next 3 days with his unit doing that, and he removed 66 bodies in total.
Yoni also met a young soldier from that same place where his commander had retrieved 66 corpses.
He hailed, in fact, from the village of Kfar Aza. And on the day of October 7, he told us that he heard the rocket fire. He obviously knew about the infiltration into his village, and he sheltered in the basement of his home with his wife and 2-month-old baby and another child. And you could tell just by speaking to him that this battle of his in Gaza, his responsibilities to the IDF are extremely personal. He called this his life's mission. And as I was leaving the area, one of his fellow officers ran up to me and he told me quite insistently that he wanted to put on the record that that person I was just speaking to had killed more terrorists than any other person in the unit.
Most of Israel's soldiers are recruits, including thousands of women who, just like the men, have to do compulsory military service when they leave school.
I did happen to ask the lieutenant colonel who was taking us on this embed what it was like fighting with the so-called TikTok generation. In Israel, there's a lot of humour and gentle disdain for the 19 and 20-year-olds who are fighting in Gaza at the moment, because the belief is that because they play a lot of Fortnite and they spend a lot of time on their phone, that they weren't really battle ready. So there's a lot of humour about the kids who are going in. And I asked him about it, and he actually said, look, it's a really good question. They've spent 100 days without their phones, which is a huge feat in itself. And then he said, look, jokes aside, they're actually amazing. They're just as resilient as we were in 2006 fighting in Lebanon and in previous wars before that. They're an incredible generation and they shouldn't be underestimated.
Yoni described this reporting trip as an embed. That's a term that became familiar to us in the media during the Iraq War, where for the first time the American military, rather than letting journalists roam freely, insisted that all journos had to be accompanied by US forces. That's now become standard for conflict reporting. So what sort of conditions did the IDF impose on you, if any, and what did you agree to?
So the conditions of the embed were fairly simple. When it comes to identifying soldiers, we had the ability to speak to practically anyone we wanted on the condition that they actually wanted to speak to us. So no one was off limits, but we were restricted in using only their first names rather than their last names. And the request, and after the embed had finished, we were requested to submit all photographs and videos that we'd taken from the front line, which I agreed to. In the end, the military censor that reviewed that footage didn't apply any restrictions to any of the photographs or videos I took. While we were embedded with the troops, our only instruction really was don't take any photographs of maps and other operational equipment. These are things that are fairly easy to agree to. I didn't send my raw copy to the military censor for viewing. It wasn't something that was asked of me in the initial stages. It was asked of me after I'd left Gaza. I queried it. I said I wasn't going to do it. And in the end, they said to me that it wasn't required anyway because I work for a foreign media outlet. But if you work for an Israeli media outlet, you are required to submit your material to the military censor. And that's just a part of the reporting life here.
Let's talk about that distinction. What's your view about why you were happy to agree to that condition that photos and videos were up for the Israelis to have a look at, but that your words, your written words, were sacrosanct?
The photographs that I took in Gaza, unbeknownst to me, could contain compromising material that might affect the operational activity of the IDF or put people in danger. Sending through the words I'd written is a completely different matter. I'm very uncomfortable with anyone in the military making any kind of editorial judgment about what I've written. It's what I saw. It's how I perceived the conflict on the day. And so from that perspective, I just didn't see it as necessary for anyone to look over my copy before it was published.
After the break, how this war is working out. Israel's stated military purpose in the battle for Khan Yunis is to eliminate high-value Hamas leaders, the kinds of people who were responsible for the attacks on October 7. I'm speaking with Yoni Bashan, our correspondent who's just returned from Gaza. Yoni, at the beginning of this war, it seemed as though it was an old-fashioned kind of siege war. Now it's become something very different. What is this conflict like now?
Yeah, I think what a lot of people probably aren't seeing and what we're not hearing about the war in Gaza is how it's actually being fought on a day-to-day basis. It's not two armies up against each other. It's a conventional army in the IDF versus what's essentially a terrorist force bedded down in Gaza. And the fighting is slow. It's slow, it's grinding, it's laborious. And the typical experience of an IDF soldier stationed in Khan Yunis or elsewhere in the territory is that they'll see a person wearing civilian clothing walking down the street, walk into a house completely unarmed. It's not someone who they're authorized to shoot, but they'll go into a house that has a tunnel shaft in it, and someone who's been inside the tunnels beneath that house has been moving ammunition into that location. So when the civilian in the civilian clothing walks into the house and emerges a few minutes later holding an RPG, the IDF soldier may or may not see them. And if they do, they've only got a few seconds to take a shot at this particular person. The window is so close that often it's very difficult to apprehend them or to eliminate them. And by the time they try, they've often fired their shot and then disappeared down the tunnel shaft. So there are, of course, several different types of tunnels that are being used in Gaza, 3 in particular. There are tunnels that are solely used for service and supply. So these tend to look like the kind that we might have seen on the IDF Twitter page, reinforced concrete, but sandy floors, no adornments, mainly used for troop movements and moving ammunition and other supplies. And then you've got other tunnels that are slightly more sophisticated in their aesthetic appearance, and these are used by the battalion commanders, or what Lieutenant Colonel Angel described as the VIPs of Hamas. They might have marble flooring, they might have tiling, better lighting, other adornments. The third type of tunnel that we see coming out of Gaza are infiltration tunnels, and these are solely used by Hamas militants to try and actually infiltrate the border with Israel. And it was actually during this embed that Lieutenant Colonel Angel took us to see one of the exits to these tunnels, which was approximately 200 metres from the border with Israel, and which was almost certainly used on October 7 by a large number of militants to rush the fence and crash through it and then effect their attack on the Israeli villages on the other side.
Yoni Bashan is the Australian's correspondent. Thanks for joining us on The Front. You can read all Yoni's reporting and the rest of our coverage of this conflict and much more right now at theaustralian.com.au.